This is the Rebel Author Podcast, where we talk about books, business, and occasionally bad words. Hello, Rebels, and welcome to the Rebel Author Podcast, episode 285. Today, I'm talking to Alex Temblador all about how to write an identity that isn't your own. First, to a comment on Charlie Alba's episode, Matt says, "This was such a joyful episode to listen to. It's so clear that you have a deep respect for Charlie, and the two of you were just having the most fun chatting. Thanks for letting us share the joy with you." So thank you for your comments. I love it when I get to hear what you think of each episode. Okay, so in a bout of news from me, my Kickstarter launched yesterday. Holy shit. Actually sure what to say. So, okay, I'll just give you the figures because that's the easiest thing for me to convey. We had over double the last campaign's pre-launch followers. So the last one was 718 before we started. This one was over 1,580. So we knew it was going to be bigger. Of course, I say no. You can't ever know, can you really? People can say whatever they like, and until they actually back and the campaign closes, you don't know anything. But all signs were pointing to positive. But you know what the self-doubt is like. So it sort of didn't really matter. We got to the launch, and the way that it works is it takes about 2 minutes for Kickstarter to fully set it live, to sort of change all the, systems over so that it is live and all the rest of it. Those 2 minutes are the longest 2 minutes of any campaigner's life. Because you're like, oh fuck, nobody's going to back. We fucked it. It's over. It's not going to fund. And actually, in reality, what is happening is that Kickstarter is just setting everything live. But it is a terrifying couple of minutes. And then, of course, it literally funded like a minute later. I did set a reasonably low campaign goal. I set it at 4,000. Probably should have set it a bit higher. But, we don't need giant numbers to fund because we have already, I've already written the books. Well, okay, I'm still writing Vows and Vendettas, but, the books are written. We know we're going to fulfill. We don't need masses of capital like a tech startup does. So I'm always like, well, we don't need a giant figure, I have said to Petra, if we hit 2,000 pre-launch followers next time, I will set a goal of 8,000 just because it seems a bit ridiculous to have it so low if the chances are you're going to fund considerably higher. Anywho, we beat the last campaign's entire total in 1 hour and 56 minutes. Let me just remind you that was 56,000 British pounds. I was shell-shocked, to say the least. This morning, I'm sat on £78,614, which in American dollars is considerably more. Let me tell you, let me do a little quick calculation here. 78,614 is $100,989. Fuck. So that's basically 101,000 US dollars. Nervous laughter. We've hit 500 backers, and my biggest concern this morning, it's really funny because I was having lunch with a friend last week, well, a couple of friends last week, and she turned around to me and said, "Your next problem is that you're going to grow out of the warehouse." And I laughed in her face and I was like, no, I won't. Chortle. I wish I stopped contradicting this person because they've never been wrong. And I'm a little bit concerned at the moment that there's not enough room in the warehouse. My warehouse, well, it's a mini warehouse. It's not really a warehouse. It's like a giant room, but it's moderately sized. But I don't know how we're going to fit everything in and still have space to pack. Like, storage wise, it's fine. There's loads of space. We have had considerably more merch backers than I anticipated. So this was a bit of a lesson for me. Everybody likes the smutty books, but they don't always like the smutty merch. But they do love the book merch. So I'm glad that we prioritise that this time over the spicy boxes. And we have had, I think, in excess of 150 swag boxes. So this is really exciting for where I want to go, and housing stock and doing merch boxes for the books going forward. And we are looking at apparel as well, which I'm extra excited about, because I'm one of these people that finds a top that she likes and then buys it 5 times so I can literally wear it every day of the week. Like, I'm not even kidding. I genuinely have like 7 of the exact same top because I just want to wear the same thing every day. I'm really funny about fabric. Yeah, let's not talk about whether or not I'm very spicy, but anyway, I'm very funny about fabric. I like wearing the same thing over and over again. And anyway, so I'm very excited at the prospect of having merch that I can just wear. It'd be like uniform. Anyway, so we have done this ridiculous campaign, and my biggest concern at the moment is that whilst my unit can theoretically take all of this stock, I'm not sure that there's enough space for packing as well once this stock is in. Because at the moment, back of the fag packet calculation, this is like over 2,000 books and over 150 items of like 6 different bits of swag or whatever. Like, that is a lot of fucking stock. It's a lot of space. I don't have enough racking right now. Fuck. So, yeah. And this is all to say I still need to write this book. Okay, oh my God, there's so much to tell you. The other thing is that I have fully relented, and I'm going to hire a packer shipper person like immediately. We've already got the job description out. I'm finalising the contract today. I need to take another 2 days out from writing, today and tomorrow. And then I think at that point I should be back to writing, because essentially I kind of had the realisation that it is not realistic, feasible, or like sensible for me to be having any hand in the packing other than content video marketing. So I will go in on a Monday, because that's the day when we have like the most orders typically from over the weekend, because we don't pack at the weekend, and then I will film on a Monday, and then I can be out of there for the rest of the week. So I'm in the process of recruiting somebody, trying to go through payroll with accounting and contracts, and oh my God, like, I don't enjoy any of this stuff. But I have said no to quite a few things in the last week. I'm really proud of myself for doing that. I'm saying no to an awful lot of other things. And it's because my goal, my purpose, my intention, all of my focus now is on getting me back writing and writing for the foreseeable future. So I don't want to be doing anything else other than that. I have got a little bit of green eye from watching people on social media who have spent the last 6 months writing instead of doing everything else. And I'm like, oh yeah, fuck, that's actually what I want to be doing. So that is now what I'm going to try and engineer, is to get myself in a place where I can spend the next few months catching up. I want to be 6 months out from each launch. I want each book done 6 months out from each launch. And the reason for that is so that I can do bigger marketing campaigns. One of the things that I am looking at is how we create our own like PR campaign. There are a ton of people who do this for straight books, but not a lot for queer books. And so, you know, I need to look at how we can do that. This matters unless I get more books written. I really feel like in the last week I've had that sort of tipping point where I'm done with everything else and I want to get back to writing. And now I have to kind of extricate myself out from finishing off all of this like employment stuff. So it's bonkers, but I'm going to go from 0 employees to 2 in the space of like less than a month. I'm shitting a brick. I will be honest, I'm absolutely shitting a brick. I never wanted to employ anybody. This is not what I want to do, not what I wanted to do, but there is no other way around this. So it is what it is. Okay. The Rebel of the Week this week is Morgan. Morgan says, I had a friend and roommate I loved but grew apart from. We shared interests like books, musicals, and I didn't realize that walking on eggshells wasn't normal. If I said no to her, I'd get silent treatment or snark. I'd even rescheduled book edits to accommodate her spontaneous plans. She called me obsessive when I edited. When I brought up friendship issues, she said I was the bad friend for saying no. What? I believed her and spent even more time with her. A month before my debut book, she asked me to help with a pet deposit. I couldn't afford it, and she stopped talking to me throughout my launch. What? When I checked in, she said nothing was wrong except that I had annoyed her. Our pattern was always silence, then reconciliation, but this time I saw things differently. While she ignored me, I built new commitments. When I said no to her again, the silence returned. She finally admitted that she was punishing me for not paying. What the fuck? Other friends reassured me I owed her nothing. I'm learning boundaries and letting go of my people-pleasing. Now I prioritise myself. My second book is flying by. I volunteer at a horse rescue and I'm reconnecting with my inner horse girl. In 6 months, I'll move out, and I can't wait for a space where I don't have to bend to someone else's comfort again. Good for you. She sounds like an absolute twat. Like, what the fuck? Also, that's so manipulative and like, what a horrible person. I'm so glad that you are rebelling and finding your inner badass, for want of a better word, and stopping those people-pleasing ways. I have had to learn to do that over the years as well. If you would like to be a Rebel of the Week, please do send in your story. It can be any kind of rebellion, something big, something small, or something in between. You can email your story to Becca over on rebelauthorpodcast@gmail.com. And we are, as always, very low on stories. 2 new patrons this week, Rachel Beanie and Jerry Fitzgerald. Thank you so much for joining. And a huge thank you to all of my existing patrons. If you would like to support the show and get early access to all of the episodes as well as bonus content, you can from as little as $2 a month by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. And the next Poison and Parlay is on, I believe, the 19th of March at 3 p.m, but it will be in the show notes anyway. Okay, that's enough from me. Let's get on with the episode. Hello and welcome to the Rebel Author Podcast. Today I'm joined by Alex Temblador. Alex is the Mixed Latine award-winning author of Writing an Identity Not Your Own, Secrets of the Casa Rosada, and Half Outlaw. She received her MFA in creative writing from the University of Central Oklahoma and is a contributor to Living Beyond Borders, Growing Up Mexican in America, and Speculative Fiction for Dreamers, a Latinx anthology. Her work has also appeared in Palabritas, D Magazine, and Colorado Review. Alex has taught creative writing seminars, workshops, and classes with the Women's Fiction Writers Association, WritingWorkshops.com, the Writers League of Texas, and more, as well as spoken about diversity in the literary world with Macmillan, Texas Library Association, Abidos Learning Conference, and many other festivals, conferences, and universities. Alex is based in Dallas, Texas, where she works as an award-winning travel, culture, and outdoors journalist. Hello and welcome.
Hi, thanks for having me.
No, thank you so much for joining me. Hopefully I pronounced everything more or less correctly. My real name's very, very long and complicated. So I always like to make sure that I, try my best to say things correctly. So I'm really honored to have you because you were actually recommended by one of my patrons. So I was doubly pleased that you were able to join us. Before we go into the topic, which is all about diversity and writing an identity that isn't our own, I wondered if you could tell me a bit more about your personal journey. Like, how did you get to where you are? Who are you? Start at birth. No, I'm kidding. But like, who are you? What's your
Oh, who am
story?
I? The big question. No, so as a writer, I actually got my undergrad in history, took a short story writing class my second year. I was only an undergrad for 3 years and decided that's it. I have to do this the rest of my life. I have to go to school for this. My parents were not exactly excited. I am very headstrong and went and got my MFA. So I'm actually, even though I've written Writing an Identity Not Your Own, and it is a nonfiction book, I actually am more focused on fiction. My first two novels were magical realism, family stories, literary fiction that really highlights kind of my Mexican American identity. Actually, my thesis for my grad degree was my first book. So I was writing fiction for quite a while and kind of got into this topic somewhat through the fictional world. Yeah, that's a little bit about me.
So that's amazing. And so obviously your bio talks about the fact that you are a journalist. Do you
Mhm.
still write fiction? Is that still and also are you traditionally published, self-published, hybrid? Like what's your fictional journey?
Yeah, great answers. So the reason I became a journalist is because I wanted to be um, a writer while I was waiting to become one day a full-time author, hopefully. I am a traditionally published author. My first book was with a small press. It's the largest U.S. Hispanic press, but it's a very small press connected to a university. My second one was a medium press with Blackstone. And then this book is with Macmillan. So I've kind of been hopping around everywhere. Yeah, I still write fiction. We're trying to sell another book right now with my agent. I'm writing another book as we speak. So fiction is definitely my first love. And I think the way, my nonfiction writing craft book kind of comes in is because I love fiction so much. I just want to see it as good as it can be for everybody.
Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. I ended up starting my fictional career by writing nonfiction just purely because I was writing down all the lessons that I learned. And because I'm old, blogs were really popular then. So I just chucked them up on a blog because I needed somewhere to store them. And I had a few get quite a lot of hits. And I was like, oh, I'll just turn them into a book. How hard can it be? Yeah.
Oh,
You know
yeah.
why I'm laughing. Yeah,
Oh,
exactly.
yeah.
Yeah, but hey, I was naive and cocksure back then. I had learnt the hard way. But anyway,
Yeah.
that's kind of how that came about. And then it was only in like the last year that things really exploded with the fiction. So
I
anyway,
love that.
that's not what we're here to talk about. We are here to talk about diversity and writing an identity that's not your own, which is an incredible resource. So I wondered if you could start with like its origin. Why did you
Mhm.
do it? Why do you think it's important? And who is the book for?
Yes. So, back before the pandemic hit, literally like a month or so beforehand, a book came out called American Dirt by Janine Cummins. It was a really big discussion in the US. I'm not sure if it got to other parts of the world. But this book came out in 2020, right before the pandemic hit, and it highlighted a Mexican woman's immigration to the US. In like basic terms, it was not through the legal means. Janine Cummins herself was not Mexican or Mexican American. She didn't identify as Latina until that book came out. Because she is technically like one-fourth Puerto Rican, I believe. Um, that is not a concern to me. What was a concern was that the book came out with a lot of stereotypes, a lot of misinformation, and it was highlighted as such by a wonderful writer called Miriam Gerba about how it had so many stereotypes, how it had possibly, some things that looked very, very similar to an actual, like to a very famous Mexican writer, Luis Alberto Urrea. So there was like big concerns with this book. The biggest problem with that was that publishing had given her like a six-figure deal, a print run that was unheard of, a marketing and PR budget that no one had ever gotten before. Um, and in at the beginning of her book, she wrote, "I wish someone browner than me had written this." And the thing was, somebody browner had written that story so many times, who was Mexican, who, you know, or who was Mexican American, or had these experiences, and publishing had not been giving these people the money, the PR, the marketing, or the opportunities, or even the publication that they deserved. So it was a huge, big conversation in the U.S. Oprah was involved, all these famous authors, and like Mexican community was involved, and then other people within the writing community was like, well, this same thing has happened to us. And with our historically marginalized community, we've seen books that have been published that are very stereotypical. Publishing keeps doing this. Why does this keep happening? Around the time I got asked to teach a class called Writing Identity, Not Your Own, with writing workshops, and I was very nervous. I did all the research, decided I would go ahead with it. What I found was there was not a lot of updated information about it on the internet. There was some fantastic websites, blogs. There had been a book written about it. I want to say, I might be wrong about this. I think it was like 2005. Regardless, it was like many, many years ago. We weren't even using the same terms anymore or talking about identity in the same way. And so I taught this class for years, realized like a 3 hour seminar, even a 4 week class is not enough time to discuss this. I had so many things within my own writing that I was kind of noticing, like, gosh, I wish I just had a guide sitting here that I can refer to every time I write, that I could have an editing checklist that I could refer to every time I write. And as I was working on my second novel with my publisher, I kind of created a section of this book, that Writing an Identity Not Your Own. And once I kind of created that section, I went to my agent and was like, hey, I guess I'm going to do this. This is a very big task, but can we see if we can make this happen? Who it's for, I mean, of course, it's absolutely for fiction writers, but I do have sections in there for nonfiction writers. I think screenwriters and people who write who write plays for theater would find it very helpful and useful. I've even had people like in the reviews. I'm wild like that. I will read reviews. Who are not writers at all, who just enjoyed reading it and learned something from it. So yeah, I think it's important to have out here. I got really tired of nobody discussing it. Nobody wanted to touch this topic with a 10-foot pole. And like, to be fair, I get it. It is a tough one. It's so convoluted and complex. But I'm the kind of person, if we have some guidelines, we're not just like flailing about, with our head chopped off, not knowing what to do.
So I love so much of this, and I have a couple of questions. One's about the market, but first of all, I think it's really important that listeners hear authenticity. So let me start by saying I'm a queer woman, but
Mhm.
I also have a mixed identity. So my grandfather is African, my father is Black, but he has a
Mhm.
white mother. And so I am diverse in my ethnicity, but I was brought up by a white mother in a very white British town, city, village. So
Yeah.
I personally find this conversation difficult because I'm always afraid of saying the wrong thing, even though I myself have an extremely diverse identity. And I also, and I think this is, and I'm saying this because I think it's important for listeners to hear that even somebody who is diverse by birth
Mhm.
struggles, because I don't want to upset anybody. I don't want to say the wrong thing, but I identify certain ways and not certain ways. And it's my right to do that because of my background. But also that makes it difficult when people might perceive you as able to talk from a particular lived experience when that might or might not be my lived experience. So I
Yeah.
find this really difficult and scary. And so I just like, for listeners, you are not alone in feeling afraid of doing the wrong thing. I too, even as a diverse woman, find it scary. So that's the first thing I wanted to say as kind of like a warm blanket hug to all the listeners. And then the second thing that I wanted to ask you about is not in a question I've prepared you for, but this is the way the podcast goes.
Let's do it. Let's do it.
How do you see the market today? Because I feel like there has been a shift. I feel like there has been some effort, and there has been an increase in diverse books. But I would love to know what you feel about the market in general.
Yeah. I do think there is absolutely a shift that has happened in time with the market. Um, I have all the numbers in my book and in terms of how, like, at least in the US publishing sphere, of how we have seen some more representation in terms of fiction. The unfortunate thing is we don't have a lot of the numbers. Like adult fiction, publishers will not provide that information. They just don't. Children's fiction is a little bit better. We do have a little bit more information. But there's also some studies that found that it has dropped in the last 2 years in terms of like queer and Black representation in literature. We've seen a lot of the like editors and they like during the pandemic, they actually did hire a lot of Black editors in publishing in the big five in the US. A lot of them are out now. They've been fired, they've been let go. They're not there anymore. I think there's like one of the like seven that they hired or something like that. It was just in a story, I want to say in the New York Times, might have been the New Yorker. But that's disappointing. Like we're also seeing that some of the diversity hiring efforts that they had is not continuing. Um, and the hard thing about publishing, we're always 2 years behind. So everything that's coming out now was bought 2 years ago. Um, and we're not going to be able to see if like this thing is continuing because we're always kind of like 2 years behind, or we will, but it's just going to take us some time. We don't have numbers on queer representation, disability representation in books, in the publishing world. Sometimes we don't have representation, like we don't have the numbers based on it's somebody within that identity writing about that identity. We just might be able to see, oh, there is like Latina representation here, but we might not have the numbers of is that person actually Latina writing about it. So even though my whole book is talking about like people being able theoretically to write other identities and create characters of different historically marginalized identities, it is very important to me that we have more opportunities, that people who are writing within their own identities do get those opportunities, do get that funding, do get the same runs and the same PR marketing strategies as people who are writing their identities. That's number one for me.
Okay. Well, so many questions, so many questions. I think the first thing I need to ask about is defining identity, both, I guess, personally, but also in literature. So, why is it so important, and why do we need to like dig into it when we're writing character? And I think the part B to that, so what is identity is the first one. And the part B is like the big $64 million question that definitely gets asked in my community the most is, can you write an identity that isn't your own? So that's maybe we should start with that one and then we'll go on to what identity is. Start there.
Okay. So the reality is you've probably already written a character that is a different identity. Unless every character in your book has the exact same gender identities, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, disability, nationality as you. You've already done it. People are still doing it. We've actually, I don't think, properly examined how women have been portrayed in literature. We continue to allow, it's usually men, cis-het, like white men who are usually writing women poorly. Fantastic book just came out called A Tale of Two Titties that looks at the stereotyping of women in literature. I would highly suggest it. So while I do believe that you can write an identity that's not your own, I don't think that people are equipped to do so most of the time. They don't have the education. We're usually not taught in either writing classes or, writing programs how to build a character whose identity is different than your own. And most of those places we're too scared to even talk about historically marginalized identities and how they interact in a story, or how that comes into play within a storyline. I mean, you were talking about being mixed earlier. I'm half Mexican, half white. I was the only person of color in my MFA program. I would write about my own experiences, and I would get back a lot of awful feedback about people's perspective of Mexicans in the US. So yeah, I don't think we're equipped. We haven't been having these conversations and we're not comfortable to talk about it. That's not to say that you can't go out here and practice. I mean, a lot of times people have secondary and tertiary characters because they're not comfortable with protagonist, and that's fair. In terms of identity, identity is distinguishing characterization, a trait or personality. It's this thing that we as a society have created because we tend to categorize ourselves into us versus them. They're different from us, so they're in this group and I am in this group. It's impacted by our social political systems, our culture, our religion, etc. But within the book, I do highlight and focus on race, ethnicity, sexual and romantic orientation, gender identity, disabilities, nationality are the main ones. And then in the back, I do kind of cover a little bit of religious beliefs, class, body type. There's so many in the back of the book. But yeah, those are some of the big ones in there.
Okay. Um, I want to ask a million things. I part of me is like, I need to write down other questions as they're coming up. But okay, let's talk about unconscious bias. So I have a degree and a master's in psychology. I had to take the unconscious bias test at university. It was the most uncomfortable experience of my entire life. And I think what people don't realize is that it doesn't matter your background. It doesn't matter like who you are or what your identity is. You have unconscious biases. Even if you don't think you do, you do. Ask me how I know. So that was a huge, humbling, shocking experience for me. But I think it's something that we need to know, especially when we're writing. So what is unconscious bias and how can we unearth something that is unconscious?
Yeah, so unconscious biases are stereotypes that we have about other groups of people that are generally not part of our conscious awareness. They do, and like you said, everybody has them. Whenever I'm kind of teaching this class, I'll be like, who has biases? And everyone should raise their hand because it doesn't matter if you're part of a historically marginalized community or not. You might have biases that are focused on disabilities, or sexual orientation or romantic orientation or whatever it may be. Unfortunately, we all have them. They come from people who raised us, the schools that we were in, the media that we are consuming, our generation, and they're always hitting you. Like you're always receiving these messages, and it's something you have to work on for the rest of your life. Unfortunately, this is not something that we can just like learn and be done with. No. But yeah, the way that they kind of can appear in your work can be through a characterization. That's a stereotypical characterization. It can be in a harmful tropic storyline. It can be something as simple as dialogue or accent, or the way you have two characters interact and how one character behaves to another. They are difficult to see. And so one of the best ways to like be able to recognize them is to do the work beforehand. I love that you took the test. There is I think it's called the IAT test that Harvard has. It's very limited. It only shows you, I think, race, sexual orientation, and gender identity. So it doesn't even focus on all the biases you could potentially have.
I had a different one because that wasn't none of that. I didn't have any biases there. I had a bias with something else, which I'll tell you offline. But I think mine came from a traumatic experience. So I think that is why I have or not small T trauma, not big T trauma, but a couple of repeated small T trauma experiences that then gave me a bias against a particular type of thing, which I'll tell you after. But yeah.
Yeah.
But still, I didn't think I was biased. So it was a shock to be like, oh, I thought I was accepting and welcoming. And, the interesting thing is as well, it will tell you how extreme the bias is. That like the type of test that I took was based on a timed reaction. And so, so mine was quite in depth, but I think it's because it was a psychological one as part of the university degree. So it was really interesting.
And can I add one little thing?
Yeah, of course.
If you do have a bias and like you recognize a bias, it's not that you are not accepting of a certain group or that you are racist or sexist or homophobic or whatever it may be. Sometimes it's so ingrained in you and you're like, I don't believe that. I know I don't believe that. but you will find it in your work. And as I have done, and I share so many examples in my book, I'll find it in my work and I'm like, I know I don't believe that. How did it get in there? Why is it in there? It's so the way your mind works and your conscious works, it's so wild to see things that you don't believe get in your work. You have this block that it just, I don't know why, but it makes it hard for you to see it unless you find it in editing or somebody else points it out. And you realize there's something so deep in there that you need to still work out.
Okay, so let's say somebody, a less diverse person would like to write a more diverse character. What are the pillars that they need to follow? What do they need to do before they start? Like, how do they set themselves up most appropriately in order to reduce any unconscious biases as best as possible, to be as, I can't think of the right words, but to be as
And well informed.
well informed. Thank you. Yeah, to be as
Yeah.
well informed as possible and write something that would be, acceptable to somebody of that background.
Yeah, I definitely think, you need to be an ally to the people who are writing within their identity. And one of the best ways to do that is to read their work, read stories that feature characters of their identity, buy their books, write reviews for them, share their books with other people, diversify your library essentially. Look at your library that's in your house or on your Goodreads or however you measure and keep track of all of the books that you've read and see where you have like little missing spaces. Like, do you read enough queer writers? Have you read enough about Bangladeshi poets or whatever it may be? Look and see where those gaps are and start reading. One of the second best things you can do is definitely do research within the community that you want to write about. So this will include not only, reading nonfiction books, looking at studies and watching documentaries and listening to podcasts. But there's a ton of different media that you can do actual research in. Look at the socio and political experiences of that identity. Look at the history. Look at the laws that affect that identity. Understands all of the experiences that people of that community face when they walk out into the world, and that they have been facing. That's a big task, but it's maybe one of the easiest in a way that you can do. The third one is the most difficult, and a lot of people push back on me on this. You need to integrate and get connected to that community. You need to make friends with people of that community. And it needs to be done authentically. Shouldn't just necessarily be done because I want to write this story. Those friends are not people who are your coworkers. Nope. You need to be so integrated that you're invited to the funeral, you're invited to the cookout, all of these things. Because when you are part of that community, when you know what they face, you are going to be more aware within your own writing of why it's so important to get it right and how impactful it can be when it's done incorrectly.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. One of the so I'm a queer woman who married a woman, and old enough that we had a civil partnership at the beginning because that's all there was. And then we were the first couple in our county to convert to a same-sex marriage. But I was in a meeting with my accountant this morning and we were talking about potentially putting my wife on the business. And I was like, well, you need to check the laws because they were talking from a kind of straight person perspective. And I was like, but don't you realize that there are 6 points of law that same-sex marriage is not equal? Like, I can't divorce my wife based on adultery, but there are also like pension regulations and stuff. So like we have same-sex marriage in the UK, but it's still not equal. And my accountant was like, wait, what? And I was like, well, right, exactly. Like, you can't just put her up. Well, we can't just put her on the business until we know for sure that there aren't like tax implications or legal. And it's things like this that people who don't have this lived experience wouldn't even think to question.
No.
And, because their point was, oh, well, you're married. It's fine. I'm like, whoa. Yes, we're married, but that doesn't mean it's equal. I think
absolutely.
Yeah, and that's such a nuanced piece of like legal whatever that people wouldn't even think to question it. So yeah, I think that's such a great point about
But if
integrating.
you're if you're reading a book with somebody who's writing about queer, like a queer marriage in the UK, you're going to notice that right away
Yeah,
and being like,
exactly.
oh, this person does not know that. Yeah.
Yeah, 100%. Um, okay. What what kind of checks should they do maybe after they've written? Like, so we kind of talked about the before stuff. What
Mhm.
about the after stuff? That so they've got a draft. Now what?
Yeah. Editing is my favorite phase. Even when I'm writing fiction, I know
It's my least favorite.
your face. I love it. And because I can shape a thing, I can actually like, it's wild. Like writing like writing the novel, I don't feel like I can control it. It's just coming out. But in the editing phase, it's like, oh yes, I can mold it. I can shape it. I can find the stuff that I couldn't see while I'm writing.
It is
So
quite
editing.
literally my least favorite bit. I do so much work on the front end, so
Uh,
that I can have the shortest editing period possible because I can't, I don't like rereading. That's my biggest
uh,
problem, which is why I try to like reduce, like I don't even reread my favorite books, you know? So that's why I try and
fair.
reduce like that pressure to reread. But yeah, I will do the mother load of research and outlining all the rest of it beforehand so that
Ooh,
I don't have to. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, I get that. Well, with editing, editing other identities, it does take some work.
Mm.
I do have a whole editing checklist in the back of my book, but essentially it's going to run you through everything to look for. So, I usually suggest that you do the regular editing, get that out of the way, like the setting, does the plot work, does the storyline work, does the characterization work, get that out of the way. Then focus on your character of historically marginalized identity that you or an identity that you don't have, that just focus on that one. Say you have multiple, just focus on one character at a time. You want to look at everything from the terminology that you've used. Are you using the right terminology? Are you using the terminology that is authentic to that character, their age, their background, the time in which they're born? You examine their dialogue. You examine how they interact with other characters. Are you highlighting a tropic relationship? So, for instance, do you have like, if you're writing about a character who is disabled and you have another character who is abled, and the character who is disabled is only there to inspire the other character, that's a tropic like relationship, right? That's inspiration porn essentially. So you examine that. You also look at everything from, I'm trying to think what I have. You also look at the storyline. So I tend to suggest doing a reverse storyline, like a reverse plot sequence, so that you can see where that character comes and play within that storyline. Are they only there to help? Is that person of color only there to help the white character learn something? That's another tropic storyline. Um, so that if you can see the storyline kind of written out in a reverse outline after you've written the book, maybe that can help. And then I highly suggest beta readers and sensitivity readers. So beta readers are people you don't pay, who might be of that identity or who have various different backgrounds that can maybe contribute and give you feedback on your uh, depiction of that character within the story. And then sensitivity readers are people who are specialized in recognizing biases. They know what to look for when it comes to writing historically marginalized identities, and that is a paid service.
Okay, where can people find sensitivity readers?
Yeah, I suggest going to places within your community. So a lot of Facebook organizations and groups will have them. There's editors of color. I'm actually looking up where I had where to look up sensitivity readers in the back of my book. I have like a whole list here of where to find them. I remember editors of color is a big one. A lot of Facebook groups, writing organizations like writing workshops that I work with will have sensitivity readers. There's a ton of different databases. I'm trying to think of the other ones right now, but I'm kind of drawing a blank because I can't remember like little
Don't
things like that sometimes.
don't worry. If it comes up, we can put it in the show notes later.
Okay. Perfect.
Okay. So what about are you, and I think you kind of like started to cover this in what you were just saying, but what about our secondary characters? Because you mentioned at the top of the show as well about how sort of a way in sometimes is to include secondary characters, but also it's very important that they're not just there to benefit and further the white protagonist. So what are some key things that writers need to do?
Yeah, your secondary character needs to be as completely built out as your protagonist, because your secondary characters are the ones that are interacting with their protagonists mostly, like consistently. They're the ones that are affecting them, inspiring them, or being in opposition to them. So these characters need to be just as built out as your protagonist. A lot of times, whether you're writing a protagonist or a secondary character, I really stress intersectionality, which essentially is this idea that we are made up of multiple identities. You know, I have a sexual orientation, a gender identity, a race and ethnicity. I'm abled. I have all these different identities, and how those interact creates a completely unique person and voice that is different from somebody who has a similar identity as me. So, I mean, just take even within my own family. I'm half Mexican, half white. My brother's half Mexican, half white. We both have the same parents. However, I came out with darker skin. My brother came out with lighter skin. That number one just gives us totally different experiences. He is queer. I am straight. He is a young millennial. I'm a middle millennial. Just different elements impact the way we see the world, impact our voices, impact how we're going to react to secondary characters or to a protagonist. So those are intersectionality is a huge thing to consider because as we know, like somebody within a race does not sound like somebody else within that race or sexual orientation or whatever, or even nationality. They don't even sound, we are completely unique within those identities.
So that is one of the things that I find the most fascinating. So I am one of five,
Ooh,
and I'm the oldest, but my next brother down, he is paler than me, but his
mhm.
hair is more afro than mine,
Yeah.
which is interesting. But then, so his mum is white, and he grew up with his mum, who then married a man of color, who was a lot darker than my father. So then his siblings from that marriage, so his half brothers, were very definitely, men of color
Yeah.
and presenting that way, whereas he could pass, I would say, for white if he really wanted to. But then he
Yeah.
grew up in a very diverse culture, a very diverse community. So his experiences are far more diverse than my experiences, despite the fact that I get questioned more than he
Mhm.
gets questioned, especially in the summer when I go really, really brown.
Yes.
And so it was always this very strange, like, and then my younger siblings have a kind of Scandinavian mother, blonde mother.
Uh,
So they have sort of medium brown skin, but very light colored hair. And so they are also grappling, now they're becoming adults, they are grappling with, well, what's their identity when they don't look
yep.
like me, despite the fact we have the same parents. And so it's just this wild, and these are all like we share 50% of our genes because we all have the same dad. And it's just
Yeah.
wild, right? Like wild that we all have this, different kind of makeup and then like lived experience as well, because they grew up with my dad, whereas I didn't.
Hmm.
So yeah, it's just like I find it so fascinating, but also that's why it's so important to recognize that no two people from a particular community will have the same lived experiences.
At
Um,
all. Yeah.
yeah. Okay. What mistakes do you see people making?
Um, a lot of that comes in the editing phase, where they will get feedback, critiques from beta readers, from their agent, from sensitivity readers, and they don't want to believe what is being uh, the advice or the insight or the pointing out of characterization. They don't want to believe it because it's so uncomfortable to recognize your bias. And I think as writers, we're so connected to our characters. Like we love them. We think of them as like children. Like we don't want to hurt them even within the storyline, that it's hard for us to admit that characterization just doesn't quite fit. Or it's not working, or we need to change it. We have a hard time changing and, killing our darlings, as they say. So I think that's number one. Number two, I see a lot of with genre, um, maybe like historical fiction. A lot of historical fiction writers, and you can be like a literary fiction writer writing in the past. People who write about the past will say, well, they did this. This is how it was. And I go, just because that's how it was doesn't necessarily mean we need to write it. One. Two, this is fiction. There's some movement here. Three, history, and this is coming from somebody who has a degree in history. History was written by the conqueror, by people who have privilege. We didn't always have the insight from the other side, from people of marginalized identities, for whatever reason it may have been. So your perspective of how it happened in history is a little skewed. It's a little biased just because the history is biased in itself. So I always question people who are writing about the past, like, I don't know. I'm gonna push back
Well,
on you. Yeah.
the most overtly mistaken case of that is the representation of Jesus, because
Oh gosh. Yeah.
he was a
White man with
yeah,
long hair. Yeah.
but was he white though? Was
But
he
was
actually
he?
white? Right? Like
Yeah,
that
yeah.
man was not a white man. Let's be
No,
real,
not at all. But they'll hold on to it. Yeah.
right?
Or justifying wanting to use certain slur words because it might have been popular in the past. That's not a good justification for me at all to traumatize your reader or to create a scene that causes sentimentality in your reader. So things like that. I also see with like sci-fi and fantasy, this assumption that just because I'm writing about a different world, I'm not writing racism in this world or sexism in this world. The reality is you can't create fantasy or sci-fi without having a basis in your own reality. So oftentimes we're like writing these stories and we go, oh, well, I don't want to talk about racism. So I'm just gonna make everybody the same race. The problem with that is actually based in like homogenization of race is a part of like racism, like that there's problems there. So the things that you don't put in there can actually showcase that maybe you're not thinking about representation. And the things that you do put in there can as well. So, you know, sometimes we mimic history within sci-fi and fantasy, and we're kinder to, the colonizers, and we're not looking at the story from the colonized perspective. So elements like that
So,
come into
so
play.
I write fantasy,
Mhm.
but I write very specifically like spicy lesbian
Ooh,
romantasy.
right
Um,
on.
but I, because I am also a millennial, but I grew up and there were no queer books really. I mean, there were like a couple, but like not well known enough for me to ever find them. So I was a
Yeah.
full-blown adult before I even discovered queer fiction. And then when I discovered queer fiction, I ended up reading so many books about coming out because like that was the thing. And I was just like,
Yeah.
I'm so
Yep.
fucking bored of reading coming out stories. Like, yes, this is a
Hmm.
huge part of my lived experience. Like, it's a big deal. But I just want to read a story where people are just queer. Like, so that's what I
Yeah.
write. Like, everybody is queer. It doesn't fucking matter who you are. The basis for my world is even if you've only kissed a girl once, you're still queer in my stories, right? Like, I don't give a shit. Everybody's going to be queer. Um,
Yeah.
because I don't want to, like, I don't want my stories to be about that. I want my stories to be about love or to be about whatever the villain is doing, or you know what I mean, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
However, and so I also take a similar stance with, diversity of other facets.
Races,
Yeah, exactly.
people, communities. Yeah.
Right. So I don't make race or queerness the thing in the
Hmm.
story. But what should I look out for? What do I still need to check for? Because just because I'm doing that because everybody is, has some kind of diversity doesn't mean there are things I shouldn't look for. So for somebody like me who wants to include it but not make the story about queerness or about race, what do I need to check for?
Yeah, I think naturally we like categorize, even though we're going, everybody is the same here, there's still maybe sometimes bias can appear in, I mean, this is just an example, the character who's only kissed a girl one time versus like a character who's always been with women their whole life. Will there be a bias in how that is presented? I don't know, but that could come up just like unnaturally being like, oh, well, that one character who sometimes kisses women, but also men or whatever your gender is in that fantasy world, right? Does that come up? If you try hard not to write about racism, weirdly enough, I can see it kind of coming up at times. Um, because a lot of times we'll show like one race had more what is the word, like more struggles than another race within that world, or it might not even be race, it might be class, it might be wealth, um it might be abilities. Like a lot of times in fantasy I don't see anybody with disabilities at all, um or there's a lot of ableism, I think, within sci-fi and fantasy at times where it's like, okay, they're blind, so we're gonna make them be able to see the future. And that is a trope that just like continually happens a lot. Or they've lost an arm, so we're gonna put a gun on their arm and give them power. This is the only way they can have power and worth is if we have quote unquote fixed them to make them normal. So a lot of times I see disabilities left out of those communities, or discussions about like one race of beings coming into an attacking another race of beings, and how are we depicting that other race of beings? Are we depicting them in the way that like um, nomadic tribes in the Middle East were kind of depicted of being like angry, or Native Americans in the US were being depicted as like attacking white colonial settlers? Sometimes those little things just appear and you you're not expecting it because you're creating this whole fantasy world. I'm also writing fantasy right now as well. So I see it come up sometimes in the way that characters speak to each other. And I'm like, wait, I did not want that to come off that way. I can see how that sounds like something in our world. And I'll make little notes to it. Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I will have to go back and kind of have a reread of like some of my books to see if anything, if I can spot anything like in light of the
Yeah.
conversation. Yeah, it's not that I am specifically trying not to write something. I'm just trying to
Yeah.
write where being queer is just is. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, that's what
And
I'm
I
craving in like to read, which is why I write it.
and isn't it funny? I mean, what you said is we didn't have, yeah, like you said, we didn't have queer books until we were adults. Like that is wild. We are like so many years behind of just like teaching and getting that representation. And as you said, I'm also tired of like the same story told for only the same identity, the coming out story for in the US, the immigration story for people of color. Like, let's move on to past that. Like what happens? What's their joys? And I do encourage people, if you're going to write a different historically marginalized identity, fine if you want to showcase discrimination. Hopefully you do it well, but you should show as much joy within those communities as you show discrimination or trauma. Like there, or it becomes trauma porn.
So, okay, so this was really interesting for me is that I actually actively avoided trying to show any homophobia in my stories for a really
Yeah.
long time because I was just sick of like that always being the thing. And I just wanted joyful queer people, to be honest.
Yeah.
However, in writing my latest trilogy, I actually couldn't avoid it.
Mm.
And so I had to show this kind of historical storyline. And I just was sobbing the whole time writing like the
Oh,
storyline because it was so lived, I suppose. Like, and
Yeah.
am definitely not somebody who's experienced, like my wife has experienced a lot more than me just because of how she presents.
Mhm.
But yeah, like that you can only avoid it for so long, I think, and then
Agreed.
it comes across anyway in your writing, like you can't help it. So yeah, I just, tried to do it as authentically as I could. And there
Mhm.
were like a lot of readers like kind of messaged and said, this cut close. Like,
Ooh,
they felt it because of how it was
it was so
represented.
real.
Yeah, it was so real.
Yeah, yeah.
Exactly.
And sometimes that's nice to just be seen, even in those bad moments as well too.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, exactly. Okay. So we're approaching kind of the end. Let's say you've had a sensitivity read and you've had
Mhm.
feedback. How do you deal with it?
Yeah, people don't love critiques. As somebody who's a journalist and author, I get so much. I love critiques. I love feedback because usually when I'm asking for it, I don't know what to do with the rest of the story. However, if you get feedback, and somebody says, "Hey, this representation is incorrect. This is offensive. This is not right," whatever it may be, I always suggest read it once, put it aside for 3 to 7 days. And if you need longer, let it sit there for a little bit longer as well. Then come back to it, read it again, think about what they're saying. So, a lot of times they're probably pointing out something that is wrong, that doesn't fit. However, if you've done enough research and enough integration community, like if you know this identity very well, you can also be able to tell, are they coming at this from their own bias, or are they coming at this as somebody who is also well informed with what they're saying? So, um, if they're saying this is not how um, let me think. This is not how somebody within the Asian community would speak. Well, how do they know that? Like, what is that their bias of their idea of how Asian people speak, or is this they themselves are Japanese and they grew up in Japan and you're writing about Japan and they have like this close idea from it. So sometimes it is hard to distinguish those. Oftentimes I suggest like having an actual conversation with that person. Because sometimes when they're writing their feedback down on paper, they're not conveying it as well as they could, or it can feel a little bit less scary whenever you're having this conversation. And getting feedback and asking questions and going deeper. And sometimes they have great insight on how you could fix something. So I always suggest giving time and then delving into it.
Okay, last question before I ask the ultimate podcast question. You mentioned there dialogue and accents. Can you
Mhm.
talk a little bit about how we either should or shouldn't approach that? Like, should we be putting accented dialogue in? If we do, like, how do we know that we're doing it right? Like, all of those kinds of, yeah, talk around dialogue for me.
Yeah. So I think we get confused a lot between accent and dialect. So accent's how we pronounce the words. Dialect is accent, grammar, and specific words that we would use within that area or community. Um, so when it comes to dialogue, there's a lot of things to consider. I suggest not italicizing language that is not English. So that can be a form of othering if I italicize Spanish. And to be fair, my first book does have that. That was not something at the time that we were doing, but nowadays it's kind of common practice not to italicize language that's not English. Other things to think about is if you're using phonetics, or you're making the dialogue sounds quote unquote like less educated for a certain community. This happens often with people of color. Whenever you have characters of color, you give them a lot more slang words, you break up their dialect, you do the broken English kind of trope. For people who are of a different nationality, who maybe English is their second language. The problem with that is that it usually does result in othering. It creates this perception to your reader that that character is unintelligent, uneducated. It's actually not true. So I am half Mexican, half white. I have Mexican side of the family and a white side of the family. I can tell you my white side they drop articles, they use like grammar that's incorrect as much as my brown side does. And they're both like English first language, born in the US, both of the sides are. Um, but usually in creative writing, we see that white communities, their language is more posher, the grammar is more correct, and we don't do that with characters of color. I also see this with characters who are disabled, will infantilize their language because we assume that they're less intelligent, or we make it so that their dialogue does not, like they can't have meaningful conversations with characters who are able. That's unfortunate and actually not true, and I wouldn't suggest doing that. There's even been studies that show that like certain identities we use more sexualized language for mixed characters, and Black characters and Latino characters. So there's a lot to think about. Like, are you using certain words and for men versus women? A lot of times they found that women are given like family making and baby making language versus like men are like strong and self-assured. They're using confident, blah, blah, blah language. So examining those, there's a lot to examine with accents and dialogue.
Amazing. Well, this is the Rebel Author Podcast. So tell everyone about a time you unleashed your inner rebel.
Ooh, yeah. So as a journalist, I actually focus a lot on diversity, equity, and inclusion. And during the pandemic, I was asked to be on a panel, and there was this conversation happening about this one outlet, travel outlet, that had basically fired their only Black editor. There was this big drama around like how they were treating Black writers and Black editors within the company. And freelancers, we all pulled back from that outlet. We weren't giving our articles to them. We weren't working with them. We were taking a stand to, diversify the industry, travel writing industry. Well, I was asked to be on a panel. The conversation came up, and nobody, within kind of journalism, like you're not supposed to like say things out loud, and kind of you're supposed to, like, if racism or sexism happens, keep it to yourself, talk amongst yourselves, but like don't put it on blast. Well, I decided to put it on blast, and I talked about it very openly on the panel. I said who the outlet was. I said what I expected from them and what we needed from them, to improve and evolve so that we could all kind of work with them again. And to this day, I still get people who were on that call. I think there was like 500 people, journalists, PR people, marketing, tourism board, who were on the call, who will message me and go, I saw when you called them out, and that was amazing. So I felt like a little rebel then. And I keep getting comments about how good it was to kind of just put it out in the open and let's talk about it. Like, let's be real.
I love it. Absolutely love that rebellion. Well, thank you so much for your time today. Would you like to tell everybody where they can find out more about you, your books, and like anything else that you want to add?
Absolutely. So go to my website, alextemblador.com. I also have a website for the book, writingandidentitynotYourOwn.com. And you can find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Threads at Alex_Temblador.
Amazing. Thank you. And of course, a giant thank you to all of the show's listeners and all of the show's patrons. If you would like to get early access to all of the episodes, you can do so by visiting patreon.com/Sasha Black. I'm Sasha Black. You are listening to Alex Temblador, and this was the Rebel Author Podcast. Next week, I'm talking to the absolute TikTok shop powerhouse that is Emily Blackwood. We have an enthralling discussion about TikTok shop, about mindset, manifestation. I absolutely love this chat, and I hope that you will join me next week for that. Don't forget to tune in and subscribe on your podcatcher. And when you have a moment, please leave a review.